Dear friends, welcome to the Priest Podcast, sponsored by the Napa Institute. You may not know it, but one of Napa's most meaningful efforts involves the formation and support of priests and religious. We have become fascinated by the stories of our clergy. Through this podcast, we want to bring you some of these amazing stories too, but in a way that is unique. Priests interviewing other priests from all walks of life and backgrounds. We think this series will be a great resource for everyone, those considering the priesthood, as well as those in active ministry who may be struggling or just looking for good ideas. But even the laity will benefit by learning more about the needs and thoughts of the clergy as we consider how to support and pray for them, given all they do for us. So sit back and enjoy this glimpse into the life and work of the priest.
Hello, everyone. I am Msgr Roger Landry, today's host for the Shepherd's Circle Priest Podcast, produced by the Napa Institute. I'm so happy today to be able to welcome the Bishop of Lincoln, Bishop James Conley, a priest originally of the Diocese of Wichita, Kansas, to join us and talk about his priestly life, his priestly vocation, what he's been able to observe about the priesthood through some extraordinary assignments for the church, both in the United States and abroad, and then what advice he would have for priests and lay faithful today with regard to the priesthood. Bishop James Conley, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here with you, Msgr.
So we normally like to begin with a priest's vocation because the Lord calls everyone slightly differently in the paths, because the only way the church can be all things to all people is if he's got different personality types who he has drawn. Nobody's cookie cut, nobody's living somebody else's vocation.
Right.
Can you share a little bit about your priestly spiritual autobiography, how the Lord draw you to him as a disciple, how the Lord draw you to him as a priest apostle?
Absolutely, yeah. I think I have to go back to my own conversion to the Catholic faith because I wasn't raised Catholic. I was raised in the Presbyterian church, more or less. We weren't very, my sister and myself were not formed in any kind of religious setting. Pretty typical of a lot of Protestants in the sense that we went to church fairly often. But I didn't have any religious formation. So I was really sort of a blank slate when I went off to college. And it was really during my university years, my undergraduate years, that I began to seek out the truth and goodness and beauty of what was going on in the world and where God was. And it was through a remarkable great books program called the Integrated Humanities, which was at the University of Kansas, where I went. It was an undergraduate freshman-sophomore program where we read the great books. In the first year as freshmen, we read the first semester were the Greeks, the second semester were the Romans, and then the second year, the sophomore year, we began with early Christian all the way up to medieval times, and then modern in the last semester. And so it was really reading the great books and starting to think about the great ideas and the big questions like, what is truth, what is goodness, what is beauty, is there a God, what is evil? And I began really thinking about whether or not I believed. I suppose I was more or less a happy agnostic when I went off to college, and then I began realizing that minds much brighter than mine, thought that there was a God, and so I better try to listen and read and understand if I really believed that there was a God. And I concluded that there was a God. And then I began to sort of church hop. I got into C.S. Lewis and was reading a lot of C.S. Lewis and landed in the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church. So if it's good enough for C.S. Lewis, it's good enough for me. But then I started digging deeper and started to study the Reformation. And then realized, well, if you were a Catholic up until the Reformation, or if you were a Christian up until the Reformation, it was really the Catholic Church. There was the East and West split, but still there was the Catholic Church pretty much dominated the early part of Western civilization. So authors like St. Augustine and Boethius and some other great Christian authors really got me to look at the Catholic Church. And so once I began to look at it, and then for me, the intellectual conversion took place with the understanding that the historical claim of the Catholic Church, that there's this unbroken apostolic succession that can trace, the current pope all the way back to St. Peter. And so that convinced me that the Catholic Church was the one true Church of Christ. So halfway through my junior year, I converted to the Catholic faith and embraced it. And I wasn't the only one. There was a great surge of conversions to the Catholic faith through this integrated humanities program over a period of about 15 years, or over 300 converts to the faith. So much so that several of my peers, their parents, thought we were all being brainwashed into the Catholic faith. So there was this big controversy, which made the program even more popular. As it, in the 70s, anything that was controversial became very popular, and so actually some parents tried to sue the university, thinking that they were proselytizing their children at a state university. And the professors that we had were not. I mean, they were just teaching the great books, and it was really our own pursuit of truth that led us into the church.
What led you to apply to the integrated humanities program?
It was really divine providence. I was at a college fair in my senior year of high school, and I saw this brochure on the table which had a picture of a typical college student in the 70s, barefoot, long hair, looking up at the sky, and there was the Big Dipper. And the motto of the program was, "Let them be born in wonder." And I opened up the page, and there were all these books, and written in beautiful calligraphy by one of the students, and it was all hand-done, pen and ink, and it was kind of different. It wasn't your typical brochure. And in addition to reading the great books, there was a poetry section, so you would learn a lot of poems, and you would go stargazing, learning the constellations of the stars, and then there was a lot of extracurricular activity, like a big fair every fall, and then a formal waltz in the spring that the students organized. So it was truly integrated. It was called the Pearson Integrated Humanities Program, integrating the liberal arts with friendship and with beauty and with, poetry, all these things, a very romantic appeal. Plus, there was a pragmatic aspect of it. It satisfied your English, your Western Civ, and your speech requirements all in one shot. So I have to admit that my motives were not all altruistic, because I said, hey, I can take this class and I can satisfy all this other stuff. So it was really just sort of, I wasn't pursuing these things, but God was just leading me there, and I enrolled in it, and from the get-go, it was just a wonderful experience.
So the intellectual conversion happens, and then the total. What happened with the total conversion?
So then I become a Catholic halfway through my junior year, and I continue to, develop, learn. In fact, the professors were pretty funny, because they said, what we're teaching is sort of a remedial program. You guys should have read all this stuff back in high school. But I went to a big secular public high school, and we didn't read anything, worthwhile. Maybe, Catcher in the Rye was probably the most elevated book we read. And so we were really learning about the great intellectual tradition. And part of the great intellectual tradition, a very big, strong part of it, is the Catholic element. And, the greatest writers, poets, architects, artists, composers were all inspired by the Catholic faith. Whether you're talking about Augustine or Michelangelo or Palestrina, and so it just kind of dawned on me that the Catholic Church had this huge influence on this rich culture that I was just diving into. And so I graduated from college with a degree in English literature, not because I was going to pursue any kind of career teaching or writing or anything like that, as I like just to read. And I realized that in order for me to graduate in 4 years, I had enough English classes at that time that I could get out, in time. And so after finishing college,
let's wait there for a second, and we'll take up when you became a farmer. But I want to talk to you about your godfather. Your godfather is one of the great figures of the last 100 years in terms of education in the U.S. We're going to be talking about the importance of education later on in this podcast. But what did you learn from Professor John Sr.?
Yeah, John Sr. was one of the three. that they team taught, but I ended up sort of studying more under him as I went through college, and then eventually when I discerned to become Catholic, I asked him to be my godfather. And he was really formed through the experience at Columbia University, where you were for a number of years under Mark Van Doren, and sort of the revival of the great books, Mortimer Adler at University of Chicago. And then kind of the resurgence in more modern times at Thomas Aquinas College. He was great friends with Professor Ronald MacArthur. And so they had this sort of friendly debate going back and forth. MacArthur said the problem with modern education today is that students don't know how to think. They need logic. They need St. Thomas. They need philosophy. And John Sr. would say, well, Ronald, I don't disagree with you, but before we can renew the intellectual life, we've got to renew the imaginative life. They haven't had any poetry. We need to go back even further to the basics. And so John Sr. was really instrumental in so many different ways in kind of drawing us deeper into the sacramental imagination. That was really what, he didn't call it that, but that's what it was. Reality, realism, poetry, music, those kinds of things that really shape the heart more than the mind. And he wasn't anti-intellectual. He loved St. Thomas, and he was a very deep thinker and writer. But he realized that the students, weren't really ready to think at that level. They needed to go back and immerse themselves into the poetic mode of education. He used to call it education by the muses and the liberal arts. And so that was his unique place. And I think, we've talked about this before, I think John Sr. is probably better known now than he ever has been. I mean, his time has come. He was sort of a prophet before his own time. And there are many, many people who now quote him here and there and everywhere. He had this understanding that in order for you to read the 100 great books, you had to also read the 1,000 good books before you read the great books. And that included everything from Aesop's fables all the way to Dickens and, the great English authors. So he was influential on me in many ways. And then going to my vocation, he had a great love for Latin and the Benedictine tradition. And so through a couple of older students, we discovered this French Benedictine monastery called Foncombeau. And a number of students ended up finding this place and spending time there and entering as monks. And when I graduated from college, didn't really know what I wanted to do. And some of my friends had already gone over there, including Archbishop Conley, who was already there, and a few others. And so I saved up my money, and I went over to France, and thinking I was only going to spend a few months, and I spent about 9 months there. And at one point during that time, and I know my mom freaked out because I thought, well, maybe I'm called to be a monk. So I'd only been a Catholic for, 2 years, and then now I'm going to, bury myself in a French monastery, never to see my family again. I discerned I didn't have a vocation to monastic life, and my mother was relieved at that and came back. But I had that exposure to Benedictine monasticism, which was, again, a very formative moment.
What were your main takeaways from those 9 months?
The basically ora et labora, which are the Benedictine ideal, and the love for the rural life, which leads to my farming experiment. So I came back, thought I was going to be, I realized I wasn't called to monastic life, I was called to marriage. So I found a girlfriend pretty soon, and my first Catholic girlfriend. And a friend of mine had inherited his grandmother's farm, and so I moved out, and he was farming in a very traditional way, with horses and organically and kind of subsistence farming. And so this relationship with this girl started to develop, and another couple moved out there, and I was sort of the fifth wheel. There were 2 young married couples and myself, and I didn't want to be a bachelor farmer my whole life. So I was really heading towards marriage and talking about it with this girl I was dating. And what changed it for me, and this is where the vocation comes in, was John Paul II had just been elected. And I had moved out to start farming in the summer of 78, and right after the death of Pope Paul VI, and then John Paul I was elected, and he died within 30 days, and then John Paul II was elected in October. And then a year after he had been elected, he came to the United States for the first time. And he traveled to, I think it was Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Des Moines, Iowa, because he wanted to go to the heartland. So we all piled into vans and drove up to Des Moines, Iowa, and I'll never forget seeing John Paul II for the first time. It was the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, October 4th, 1979, and we're all out there in this field, 300,000 people, and he comes out. It had been raining all morning long. All of a sudden, the clouds broke, and this helicopter descends from heaven and comes down and lands right next to this outdoor Living History Farm altar set up. And he got out and celebrated the Mass. And then I remember at the end of the Mass, as he was wont to do, he made this appeal to young men. And he said, "Young men, have you ever considered the priesthood? Jesus Christ is calling you. Come, follow me." And I just was mesmerized by him. And I can still remember his voice in that broken Polish accent, thinking to myself, I want to follow this guy. I don't know where that's going to lead me, but I want to follow this guy. And I came back, it was during harvest time, and was working long days, and I just couldn't get off my mind the priesthood. It's just kind of like the priesthood. And so I talked to my girlfriend about it, and of course, she was a very good Catholic girl, and she didn't want to come between God and a vocation to the priesthood. So she said, "Well, you need to talk to a priest about this." And I didn't really have any close priest friends, but she was very close to her pastor in Wichita, which is one of the main reasons why I ended up being a priest in Wichita. So she's the one that actually set up the appointment with Msgr. Walsh. She was the rector of the cathedral where she went. And that was the first time I talked to a priest about, possibly a vocation to the diocesan priesthood. I thought that, if I'm not going to be a monk, well, then I'm going to get married. For some funny reason, I never thought about the diocesan priesthood. But then when that became an option, and I talked to this Msgr. Walsh, who ended up being the priest who preached my first Mass, years later, that became a real option. And I, for the first time, thought, well, maybe God is calling me to be a priest in the world as a diocesan priest. And things happened real quickly. That Mass, as I said, was October 4th, 1979. By January, I was in the seminary. And in those days, things happened real quickly. Now I'm glad there's a little more scrutiny. I don't think I would have gotten in that quickly today, and probably rightly so. I mean, they didn't have psychological exams. It was like, the bishop calls up, "You got a bed for this guy? Okay, you're in." That was it.
And so then you go to Kentucky for philosophy, and you're sent to Emmitsburg, Maryland, to Mount St. Mary for theology.
Right.
What were the big ways that you grew during your years in seminary?
Well, I fell in love with the studies. I never had studied formally philosophy or theology. So already, being an English major, I liked to read. And then when I began studying philosophy and then theology, I just dove deeper into the great intellectual tradition of the Catholic faith, and that kind of shaped my whole way of looking and seeing the world. And that was going into kind of the height of the JP2 years, and all of his writings during the time of my seminary formation, and I just couldn't get enough of it. And so I went to a great college seminary where we studied St. Thomas, and I had some great philosophy professors. And then I went to Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland. We had some great professors there. But it was still a time in the church that, was pretty contentious. You had the proportionalists and the situation ethics going on one side, and, Humanae Vitae was still being debated. But I enjoyed that back and forth, and wanting to devote my priesthood to to teaching and preaching the great tradition of the faith, and to be solid and faithfully orthodox to the magisterium. And John Paul II was a great champion of that, especially as he issued those great encyclicals like Evangelium Vitae, Veritatis Splendor, Fides et Ratio, those were, to me, those 90s, that's after I was ordained a priest, kind of really solidified the settled teaching of the church. And I just wanted to preach and teach that in my priesthood.
Is this where you fell in love with St. John Henry Cardinal Newman?
Yes. In fact, I first heard of Newman when I was still in college. It was part of the last semester of the humanities program. We read a few selections from his idea of a university, Knowledge for Its Own Sake. And there was something about the writing style of Newman. It wasn't easy because he was very Victorian and long sentences, but there was a beauty to his writing. And like very few, to read Newman is to know Newman. You knew, okay, this was something he wrote in his Protestant years. This was something he wrote in his Catholic. So you could kind of place his own life in what you were reading. So Newman just grabbed my heart. And eventually, fast forward until I become a bishop, I chose his motto as my own bishop: heart speaks to heart, cor ad cor loquitur. But I remember I had to write a paper in college, and it was on Newman, and that was for an English class, major British authors after 1800. And I had just become a Catholic. And I remember I asked my mom to type that paper for me. And that really began my love affair with Newman. So following his life, converting to the Catholic faith, seeking the priesthood, and then continuing, to be this great light, I just sort of followed his life and read everything I could get of him.
I want to talk about one other holy figure from your seminary years. While you were at Mount St. Mary's, an alumnus of Mount St. Mary's was murdered as a martyr in Nicaragua. Now Blessed Stanley Rother, a priest of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. What was that like? Was that big news when you were at Mount St. Mary's that an alumnus had just been slain for the faith? And if so, did it have an impact on you and your brother seminarians at the time?
It was during our years, and I had to, once I got to know about Stanley Rother, it was kind of vague. I mean, it happened while I was in the seminary, 1981.
By the way, Stanley Rother was a Mount St. Mary's alumnus. Just
Correct.
To stress it. Yeah.
Yeah, he had gone to Mount St. Mary's, and in fact, he had made a retreat at Mount St. Mary's during that time when he left Guatemala, and he was discerning on whether or not to go back, and through his spiritual director and his own bishop, he decided to go back, and it was then that he was martyred. We only heard a little bit about him, and of course there were a lot of things happening in Latin America, and some other missionaries being martyred during those times, Romero and people like that. So we really didn't know much about him until after I was ordained a priest. And we, at the time, and probably just didn't pay attention too much, but at the time we knew about him, but he really didn't become known to seminarians until in the 90s, after I had left the seminary. But I'm always very proud that he was a Mount grad.
So then you were ordained in 1985.
1985, exactly. Just celebrated my 40th.
Congratulations. What do you remember of the events around your ordination? What was going on inside as everything was happening on the outside? Likewise, your first Mass and the transition and your first baby steps as a priest.
Well, my first for a few years as a priest, I got very involved in the pro-life movement. And my bishop, at a very early age, when I was 2 years ordained, appointed me the pro-life director for the diocese. And it was about that time that Operation Rescue was getting off the ground, and I was involved in the Operation Rescue movement, which is civil disobedience of basically laying down in front of abortion clinics and passively, peacefully blocking the entrance. And for me, those were very rich days for me, because it felt like we were the early Christians, and we were really laying our lives down for the unborn, which we were, in order to save babies and mothers from the tragedy of abortion. And that was real formative for me. In the middle of that, I was appointed to Rome to get a license in moral theology, which was great because I was there, involved in the pro-life movement, and the degree, the license in moral theology just gave me more intellectual understanding about the dignity of human life and sacredness from the very beginning, moment of conception. And so when I came back from Rome, I was appointed to the Newman Center at Wichita State University. So that began a phase of my priesthood with university students. And I ended up spending a good portion of my priesthood in serving on college campuses. Wichita State University for 4.5 years, and then chaplain to the University of Dallas when I was called back to Rome a second time. And then Christendom College, taught for 2 years, moral theology for them, and then coming to Lincoln, actually in Denver and in Lincoln. Denver, Archbishop Chaput appointed me to the universities that were there, and Focus was just getting off the ground. And then back, and when I was finally appointed to the Diocese of Lincoln in 2012, we have a very robust and active Newman Center at the University of Nebraska. So a good portion of my priesthood has been serving in college campuses and campus ministry. And part of that love for serving as a campus minister and working with college students is because of my own experience of everything happening during my college years. I know how important those years are and how you make these decisions which shape the trajectory of your whole life. I mean, whether it's a vocation or marriage, and you're young and you're making these decisions, good ones and bad ones. And I just love to kind of go through that with college students as they're deciding what am I supposed to do in life, and making these big decisions. And I just enjoyed being part of that in all those places I was.
Did that service of young people in college keep you younger?
It did. And I realized, going on later on in priesthood as I got older that I couldn't, college students don't wake up till 10 p.m. And I realized that I couldn't keep up with that pace like I used to when I was younger. And as much as I loved it, I realized I got to go home and go to bed. I can't stay up with these kids.
Including at the University of Dallas?
Including at the University of Dallas, because they, the evenings is when I would go out there. And I would come back late, then have to go to work at the Vatican. Vatican by day, college students by night. But I was young then. I could do it. But as I got older, I realized that I can't keep up this pace, which eventually kind of led to my own struggles with my own mental health.
So you're still a young priest, loving your work with young Catholics at Wichita State Newman Center. And then you're asked to go to the Vatican and work at the Congregation for Bishops, working in an office. You were moonlighting as the chaplain of the University of Dallas. But what was your experience like for a decade working in the Congregation for Bishops? What was your typical day like? How did you grow? Were there any struggles? Were there any particular joys in the office?
Yeah, I saw my time there, and I look back on it with great fondness because here I was now, a Protestant kid, having no contact with the Catholic Church, my first 20 years of life. And then here now I'm in my late 30s and I'm working in the Vatican right next to the Pope, and not just the Pope, but St. John Paul II. And I sometimes had to just pinch myself. I can't believe I'm working here at the heart of the church in the middle of this great pontificate and working in a department, a congregation, a dicastery now as we call them, that assists the Pope in the naming of bishops. And there were 3 of us that worked at the English desk, following all of the English-speaking dioceses. And so whenever a bishop would either retire or die or be moved, then we would work with the apostolic nuncios in the different countries and presenting candidates, kind of screening and vetting candidates for the Holy Father to choose as a bishop, as a successor to the apostles. And so I was, again, it was a desk job and I was a lowly official, but I was part of that whole structure of knowing that these names were passing across my desk and going up to more superior people and eventually to the desk of the Pope, as he every week for 48 weeks out of the year, he's choosing, 3, 4, 5 bishops every week. So that was thrilling, even though I was just sort of a little, kind of part of that chain. But it was also a desk job. And as a priest, we're called to, be pastors of souls. So I knew I had to find an outlet for some sort of pastoral ministry, and then this position at the University of Dallas as chaplain came up. One of the priests that I was working was called back to his diocese, and they were looking for a chaplain, so I said, I'll try it for a semester. Ended up being there for 13 semesters, and that was life-giving for me, even though it was kind of exhausting after working all day at the Vatican and then jumping in my car and battling the Roman traffic out to Due Sante for Tokyo. But once I got out there and being with those college students, and for a priest, it was like a dream come true, because you have these American students who are, plopped into Rome, and they're mostly Catholic, and then they see Rome for the first time, and you know how it is living in Rome. It's just, you see the church, and you could see it with these college students, and a lot of them were really good Catholic college students, but then when they came to Rome, it was like, oh, this is all real. This was, this is really this is the church, and that was a great thing to be a chaplain for.
When you were in Rome, you had the chance on a few occasions at least to meet one of our mutual heroes, St. John Paul II. Did you ever bring up Iowa with him?
I did the first time, and I told him that, he was really the reason why I was, thinking about becoming a priest at that point in my life, and it was such a moving thing. And he kind of smiled and he said, Iowa, I remember Iowa. And so that was an opportunity that was good. There was another funny opportunity happened when I met him. My parents came over for their 50th wedding anniversary, and it was the same time that he was celebrating his 50th anniversary as a priest.
In 1996.
Exactly. And my parents were married in 1946, so 47, but it was right around that time. And so I told the Holy Father, when we had a special audience, I said, my parents over here celebrating their 50th, and then, he looks, he's very good, very good. He looks at my mother, and she starts talking. When she gets nervous, she's talking. He says, yes, Carl and I were married in 1947, and you were ordained a priest. She just went, my dad and I are looking at her like, kind of keep it down here. She's kind of hogging the conversation. And he looks, smiles, and he looks at my dad, and he goes, 50 years, long time, no?
And so I want to talk about your parents before we move on, because you had a unique opportunity to baptize your parents and receive them into the Catholic Church. And so what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, that was extraordinary. One of the things, some wise priest told me, when you're ordained a priest, write down some special prayer intentions and put them on your heart. And as you're laying there prostrate, being ordained a priest, ask for these prayers. And one of them was the conversion of my parents. And at that time, in 1985, they weren't really even thinking about becoming Catholic or anything. And so while I was away in Rome doing a license in moral theology is when they, unbeknownst to me, started to look into the Catholic Church. And I think it was the influence of my brother seminarians who they got to know, Archbishop Conley, of course. We were childhood friends, played on the same baseball team when we were in the 7th grade. My dad was the coach, so they knew him. And then they met my first pastor, who was this wonderful Irish priest, and my dad just fell in love with him. And Father Donald O'Hare, a foreign-born Irish, FBI. And so all this was happening to them, and they went through this process. And finally, I got a letter from my mom, and she said, your father and I have been looking at the Catholic Church, and we've decided we want to be baptized. Unbeknownst to me, they had never been baptized. I conditionally baptized them because there was doubt on whether or not we couldn't have we didn't know where a baptismal certificate was, so I went ahead just to be safe and baptized them. And it's a funny story with my dad. I often tell this story. When I became a Catholic in my junior year of college, I made the mistake, and I don't recommend this to anybody, of not telling my parents that I was becoming Catholic. So I came home and sort of announced it at Christmas, and my mom was, she says, that's great. And she was just glad I got my hair cut, and I was kind of cleaning up my act and going to church, and I found religion. And my dad, he said, I saw this coming. He says, son, you've given up your freedom to think on your own. Now the Pope's going to do all your decision making. The Catholic Church is going to tell you what to do and when to do and where to do it. And he says, if you want to do that, son, You're old enough to make that decision, but I'm just telling you that. Well, I got in an argument with him and said, no, I can still think my own, that's not right, that's not true. And so fast forward 6 years, my parents decide to become Catholic. We're in the church, my first parish, my bishop's there, a lot of my priest friends are there, parishioners are there, and my mom comes up to the baptismal font, and I baptize her in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. She steps aside, my dad walks up, and just as he's bending down over the font, I'm getting ready to pour the water. I said, no, Dad, if I do this, you're going to give up your freedom to think on your own. The church's going to do all your thinking. The Pope's going to make all your decisions. He said, go ahead. He became a very devout Catholic.
So that's a different type of conditional baptism.
Different kind of conditional baptism, yeah.
So you work for a decade in Rome, and then you're called back by the Bishop of Wichita, and you made a pastor of Blessed Sacrament for a couple of years.
For a couple of years.
What was the experiences of being a pastor like for you?
It was wonderful. It was really what all priests are ordained for, to become pastors of parishes and pastors of souls. And I was given this beautiful parish, Blessed Sacrament in Wichita. I call it like a scene right out of a Norman Rockwell painting. There were these little neighborhood called College Hill, and most everybody was Catholic in that neighborhood, and the bells would ring in the church, and all the kids would walk out of their houses in uniforms, and they'd walk to church and the school every day, and it was just a great first pastorate. I was pastor of the Newman Center, but this was a real parish in the sense that it had an elementary school, and it was a good-sized parish, and I had an assistant, and it was just a great assignment for me coming back from Rome after 10 years. And I was there for 2 years, and then I got the call.
What was the call like? How much of a surprise was it?
Big surprise. Even though I worked in the Congregation of Bishops, I just didn't think that I would get the call, or if I did, it would be later on, maybe. But you do kind of just put that in the back of your head. Any priest could get that call, and all priests say it was a surprise. It was a surprise, but it was Benedict. So Benedict was the Pope, and I got the call from Archbishop Sambi, who was the nuncio at the time, and. I tell typical. I says, "Could you repeat that for me, please?" And he told, "Yes." The Holy Father's named you auxiliary bishop in Denver. Do you accept? And I remember I was on my way to hear. It was during Holy Week, and I was on my way to hear confessions at the high school, and I just was saying, it was just so discombobulated. I said, "Well, can I think about it, and give you a call tomorrow?" He's probably thinking, "What's wrong with this guy?" And I think I just needed to have some time to think. And he said, "Of course, call me tomorrow." And I remember he said in his broken Italian, he says, "But just remember," and he told me this story. I found out that he told this story to a lot of different guys. That, he was nuncio in Palestine. He says, "I remember walking many times around the Sea of Galilee, and I remembered that passage from Matthew where Jesus is calling his first disciples, and they dropped everything and said, 'Yes, call me tomorrow.'" In other words, like, you are going to say yes. And I did say yes.
And so you go out to Denver, and you're an auxiliary bishop there. You're helping out with universities. You're seeing the fruits of the new evangelization that Archbishop Chaput had ignited there in the Rockies. What was it like learning how to be a bishop from one of the great Episcopal figures in recent U.S. Catholic history?
Correct. I learned everything from him. He was a mentor. He was a father. He was a leader. I just felt so privileged to begin my Episcopal life as a bishop under his tutelage. And he was someone who was a man of action, a man of decision, a brilliant man, and just a joy to learn from. And I look back at those 4.5 years I was in Denver, and they were so formative to me. And I really modeled my Episcopal ministry after his, trying to lead in the way that he led, and learned the way of leadership through him. And he was hugely impactful in my life as a bishop.
And you were a quick study, because within 4 years,
yeah,
Pope Benedict was at it again.
He was, yeah.
And you received another telephone call and said you were going to be going to Nebraska. What was that like?
Well, it was, in a way, I was excited about being an ordinary because I'd been auxiliary about 4.5 years, and so I felt like I was kind of ready to lead a diocese. And then when I heard it was Lincoln, I was really joyful because I knew the Lincoln Diocese and had a great reputation for vocations to the priesthood. I knew actually some of the priests I was in the seminary with, both in philosophy in Kentucky at St. Pius X and at Mount St. Mary's. So some of the priests who were my contemporaries were serving in Lincoln. So in a way, it was sort of a homecoming because I knew about the diocese, and Bishop Bruskowitz, of course, he looms large in the history of the Catholic Church in the United States because he, held things together during those really volatile years, and really continued to build that culture of vocations that were built by Bishop Flavin, who preceded him. Bishop Flavin was Bishop of Lincoln from 68 to 92, and then Bruskowitz was 92 to 2012 when I came. So there was really like 40 years of great leadership, and I was a beneficiary of that because we were flush with vocations. We had the highest number, and still do have the highest number of seminarians per capita. And the median age of all of our priests, we have 156 priests, is 49 years old, which is a good 12, 15 years younger than the median for most dioceses. So I knew I was going into a diocese that was healthy and strong and a young presbyterate. So I was just thankful for that.
Lincoln has the reputation, perhaps with the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, of being one of the strongest places for priestly vocations in the United States. What makes the soil in Lincoln so fertile? You mentioned 40 years of good Episcopal leadership, and now that is 55 years of really good Episcopal leadership. But what is it about the families? Mm-hmm. Is it the Catholic schools and religious formation programs? What helps such a strong vocational culture in the Diocese of Lincoln?
That's a very good question. The schools play a large role because we are able to capture about 50% to 60% of all of the school-age kids that go to Catholic schools because Bishop Flavin made schools the absolute number one priority. And so families, the culture of Catholic, and the schools remained, even to this day, the Catholic identity is very clear. It's been clear for 55 years. And from the schools, most of our vocations come. In fact, we have just now, we've got 9, when I go back, I'll be interviewing 9 candidates, and they've been vetted a bit, so I know they're pretty much going to be accepted. They've gone through their psychologicals, and 8 of the 9 are graduates from our high schools. And that's about average. We get about 90% of all of our vocations now come out of our schools. And not only that with the priesthood, but also there are 2 religious communities of sisters that we have, the School Sisters of Christ the King and the Marian Sisters, and most of those sisters come out of our Catholic schools. And the good families that come out of our schools. So it's one of those things that Catholic education has been at the center of it, and then from that come good families, and from good families come good, generous vocations. And it's just sort of it's a mutually sort of enriching experience of Catholic culture.
Talk to me likewise about the role of parishes in forming future vocations, the relationship of the bishop with his altar boys, the various activities that are available in a particular parish. What role has that played?
Well, you mentioned altar boys. We didn't give in to the girl altar servers. That one of the things that Bishop Flavin was adamant about, and this is going back into the 70s, is that, and of course there weren't any altar girls then. And Bishop Flavin instituted lectors and acolytes. He really saw that men need to be called forth to take an active part in the life of the parish. And so he took the Second Vatican Council at its word, so he started to cultivate lectors and acolytes, men, because those ministries are reserved to men. And when altar girls were allowed, Bishop Bruskowitz decided they would not have altar girls. And so it was a tension, because I think Arlington and Lincoln were the only two dioceses that didn't have any girl altar servers, which is allowed by the church. But I think that was an important decision, because we were able to kind of retain a certain kind of masculine presence around the altar that made it attractive for young boys and young men to feel like, this was something that they could aspire to, that was uniquely kind of identified with males, and I think that was a good thing, and it still is, and I have no intention of changing it. And now it's such a part of the culture that nobody really questions it anymore. And it's not anti-woman or anti-female, because we have these great religious orders of communities, of sisters, but also the families and mothers and wives that have a large part to play in teaching in the schools and serving the church in various ways, according to their feminine genius, as John Paul II would say. So I think it's created a culture of vocation.
We've discussed twice already about the priority that you place in education. But one of the biggest and boldest things that you've done in your 15 years as the Bishop of Lincoln is build an extraordinary new church. I don't know if it's classified as a chapel or a church, but church and campus ministry center there at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. What led into that choice for you? Was that a no-brainer for you to be able to do an absolutely top-notch campus ministry center so that programming could take place and touch a lot of other young Jim Conleys, who the Lord would be calling them one way or the other to live up to the vocations to be saints in the church?
Right. That was one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, college students were really close to my heart. And so when I came to the Diocese of Lincoln, there already was a great tradition of campus ministry there at the Newman Center, which had been going strong for a number of years, back even into the 80s and even 70s, that a lot of the vocations were coming out of the Newman Center at the University of Nebraska. And we had an opportunity at that point in time. The facility was old, it was dated, and then the chaplain of the Newman Center was Father Robert Mattia, and he had this idea of building a really beautiful, larger Newman Center, Catholic Student Center for college students. But he wanted to really build it top-notch, like you said. He wanted to have it beautiful, and wanted to have a place where students could really be attracted to come in and experience the beauty of the church and the beauty of the liturgy. The other building just wasn't suitable, so I kind of gave the okay to tear that building down and build another one. And it became a bigger project than we really anticipated, and we were in debt for a long time, but finally we were able to kind of pay the thing off. We built a fraternity of men behind it, which would be sort of a feeder to the leadership, and then Focus, Fellowship of Catholic University Students. The University of Nebraska was the third campus that they came to. They started at Benedictine College, and then the second campus was University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. And then the third campus was University of Nebraska, and it became, even before I got there, a good training ground for Focus missionaries. And now we do summer training every year. We've done it 3 years in a row. Ave Maria and the University of Nebraska do summer training for Focus missionaries. So the whole culture of campus ministry and evangelization and Focus was very strong already. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to it, which wasn't there, was this Newman Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, like the experience I had, that students could come and take courses in the great books and have those courses be transferred over to their degree programs, whether they're in agricultural science or biology, pre-med, or education, whatever it is. They could take some core courses taught by our faculty that would be transferred over through the registrar into their degree programs. And so we successfully launched that in 2015, and it was tough the first 4 or 5 years, but now it's off the ground. We had like 170 students last year, and it's continuing to grow, because I think students are looking for again, truth, goodness, and beauty, and the great richness of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And we're able to do it at the Newman Center at a big public university, sort of like, in a way, even better, really, than what I had at University of Kansas, because that was not Catholic. This is specific. This is, clearly Catholic.
Talking about education, there are three basic tasks of a priest, of a bishop, even as a disciple. One is governance, and a lot of bishops spend a lot of their time on governance. One is sanctification, and most bishops take the sanctifying munus, as we say in Latin, quite seriously. But not all that many take the munus docendi, or teaching, seriously. You do. You've written many different pastoral letters. You write a regular column in the diocesan newspaper that gets a lot of national play. You're writing things like First Things, etc. You clearly take your teaching responsibility seriously. I'd like to talk about one of your pastoral letters, which is about mental health, and it came not just looking out at what the church needs, but there was an autobiographical aspect of that as well. Could you share with us?
Sure. I think that it kind of gets back to when I was talking about my love for college students and sort of thinking I was still a college student. And for me, it was in the late teens, 2018, 2019, and it was sort of there were a lot of things that happened. It was sort of a perfect storm of bad news in the church. There was the McCarrick scandal, there was the Pennsylvania grand jury report, and there was the whole horror of clergy sexual abuse of minors. And we had pretty much been unscathed by that. Although, not unlike every other diocese in the world, we had cases, and it all exploded. Globally, in the church again, after 2002, 2018, and then locally. And I had to remove a number of priests, mainly for adult sexual misconduct. But there were some past cases, and the state of Nebraska launched not a grand jury report, but the Attorney General wanted us to turn all of our files over. And so all three dioceses did that, and there were cases that were being looked at, and it was a process where, for me as a bishop, I was very, it was traumatic, because this horrific scourge of abuse that has been plaguing the church for so long kind of came home. And and at the same time, there were a lot of other factors that entered in. My sister was diagnosed with breast cancer. She survived, thanks be to God. I had to close 2 schools that were in the poorest part of the diocese, were just unsustainable. One of my priests died suddenly of alcohol. And all these things kind of converged at once, and I found myself just trying to figure out what is the pathway forward. And I would lay at night and go through each one of these scenarios, not realizing that I went for days and then weeks without sleeping. And after a sustained period of time like that, my body began to break down, and I became physically exhausted. And then the anxiety of these unknowns went into kind of a depression. And I remember my sister telling me, I was visiting her, she lives in Kansas City, and she goes, "You look awful." And I said, "I feel awful. I don't want to go back." And I really reached this point where she said, "You need to take time off." She said, "You're going to kill yourself, because you can't continue to maintain like this." So between her and Archbishop Conley, my closest bishop friend, and Bishop Wall, and some other friends, Bishop Olmsted, I said, "Yeah, you need to get some time. You need to get out from under this." And by this time it's 2019, so I've been going like a year through this. And so I went to the Apostolic Nuncio during one of our November plenaries, and Cardinal Pierre, then Archbishop Pierre, I said, I'm just, I need some time off. And he was wonderful. He was like a father. He looked at me, he says, "Yeah, you look awful." He said, "You need some rest." And I had already set up a thing with Bishop Olmsted, who was my former bishop, if I could come we're going into the winter months in 2019. I didn't want to go someplace dark and cold, so I went to Phoenix, the Valley of the Sun, and went down, took my leave, and I thought I'd only be gone for a couple months, rest up, get back on track. But I like to say, in December 2019, I took a leave of absence for health reasons. And then in March of 2020, the whole world took a leave of absence for health reasons when the pandemic hit. And so I ended up being gone for 11 months. And it took that long for me really to get my strength back. I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. I went on medication. I had a good therapist, a good Catholic therapist who worked with a lot of priests in Phoenix. Had a good medical doctor and a good spiritual director. And a combination of all of those, that help, those resources, I kind of regained my equilibrium. And then my therapist said, well, you should follow a bishop, shadow a bishop for a while before you go back. So I went down to Oklahoma City and spent a month with Archbishop Conley, and then spent a month with Archbishop Newman in Kansas City. And then in November of 2020, I went back, and it really taught me a lot about, the stress that not only bishops have, but priests have, and what's the expectations that are placed upon us as as priests and bishops, and how we really need to live healthy lifestyles and take seriously sleep, eating, exercise. We can't go 24/7, and I know a lot of priests work, and that leads to burnout, which is another occupational hazard, which I experienced, and just learned a lot about it and being open about it. It was funny when I went to the nuncio, and finally, when I got the permission from Pope Francis, I asked him, I said, well, what should we say? How should we message this? And he said, tell them the truth. You're exhausted, you're depressed. And so that's what I did. And thanks be to God, I didn't say, well, the bishop is taking a leave for personal reasons, because in that atmosphere, people, oh, what happened here, I just said, look, I'm exhausted. I need rest. I'm depressed. I'm having mental health issues, and that was the best thing I could have done, because people showered me with prayer and love, and letters like, yeah, my son's gone through this before. I've gone through this before, and being so transparent and vulnerable about it was really the best thing, not only for my recovery, because I didn't have anything to hide. I could just be honest about it, but also it gave permission to others who were struggling, especially priests and bishops, who maybe were fearful of being open about it. It gave them permission to be open about it and get the help they needed.
There's a stigma associated with psychological care where there isn't if you break bones, there isn't if you've got some cardiovascular things.
Diabetes or whatever, you're not ashamed of that.
I remember when I was in seminary, then Monsignor Timothy Dolan, because we had a priest psychiatrist on our staff, and he said, I know a lot of you are afraid to go to see Father O'Brien, but you don't have to go say you're seeing a shrink. You're going to see a priest, Father, who just happens to be trained in these areas. Have you encountered that stigma in the priesthood since your own use of a psychiatrist as part of the team to help you to get better? And what would you say to the church in 2025 with regard to the necessity of making sure we take just as good psychological care of ourselves as we do the spiritual care and physical care?
Yeah, I do see it still as a stigma, and one of the things we do for our seminarians is I tell them, look, you need to have a good spiritual director, and also you need to have an opportunity to receive counseling, because we're all wounded, and so there should be no shame at all in getting counseling. Maybe you just need one time or two times, or maybe you got to go every other week, but don't be ashamed of that. And so it's still hard for those to admit that, and there is still the stigma, but I think that stigma is beginning to lessen. I think it's beginning to lessen a lot, and even, for example, the NFL speaking about it, because athletes are under such great pressure, and I think it's slow, but more and more our society and culture is removing the stigma, and then the message being, if you need to get help, don't be afraid to get help, because there's a lot of people out there to help you.
We have a lot of priests listen to this podcast. If they themselves were struggling with some of the similar issues, maybe priestly burnout, maybe the incapacity to sleep, tinnitus, whatever, and they might be a little intimidated to go to their bishop for whatever reason, what would you say to encourage them to have that important conversation?
I would say a couple things. One, you would bring it to your spiritual director first, because you got to talk to somebody who, you got to, I wouldn't go to the bishop first, but you talk it over with your spiritual director and maybe a brother priest, and rely upon that little kind of that first circle of intimate friends, trusted friends. And then if it persists and you really feel like you need to let your bishop know, then don't be afraid to go to your bishop. And don't let it, what I would say is, don't let it reach a crisis, so then you have to go to your bishop. I mean, I would not be afraid to go to tell your bishop, say, I'm struggling with some anxiety right now, and I just want to let you know that, and get his support and ask him for his prayers. And then if it does come to the point where you really feel like you need to step down or get some help or go away, then the bishop is going to be supportive. He's going to not be shocked about it or anything. He's going to know that you've been honest with him and that you can trust him. Because the bishops themselves now, I think, especially even younger bishops than me, realize that as a bishop, they also have to be a father to their priests. And just
Thanks again for joining us today. For more information about how you can join us in supporting our work with clergy and religious, go to napa-institute.org. May God bless you this day and always.